Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to take a quick look back at our 2023 tornado season forecast. If you recall, back in early March we made a video detailing some of the factors that modulate tornado frequency and distribution in the United States during the spring, and we made an actual forecast for tornado frequency and distribution in the U.S. for that March through June timeframe, that quintessential tornado activity timeframe in the United States. And since it's the end of July, I thought it'd be a really good time to go back and see how our forecast did. So that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. We're going to detail some of those factors that we talked about and see how they progressed throughout the season and look at how they impacted tornado frequency and distribution in the U.S. throughout that March through June timeframe and see how our forecast actually did. Now, in this video, I'm not going to do as much of a deep dive into each of those factors as we did in that initial video. So if you want to take a look back at all that information we talked about each of these factors in that original video, I'll put the link to the original video in the description box below. It's also up here at the top left corner of your screen. If you want to go and check that out and see what our forecast actually was. Of course, we'll be doing a quick review of those factors and telling you what our forecast was in this video, but if you want to go back and go through the full video, I'll put the link in the description box below so you can reference it whenever you'd like. Also, of course, just a caveat, we're forecasting tornado frequency and distribution in the United States for that March through June timeframe. We're not talking about storm chasing as a whole. There were a number of days, especially in June, where we had almost daily occurrences of just beautiful supercells, well-structured, hail-producing supercells in that high plains region. Almost daily awesome storm chasing, but of course we're talking more specifically about the tornado frequency and distribution in the United States this year. Of course, if you were out storm chasing, you know it's a pretty prolific year for storm chasing as a whole, but of course, as we talked about in our previous video, this is a forecast for tornado frequency and distribution across the United States for that March through June timeframe. So with those caveats out of the way, let's go ahead and dive in. So the three main modulating factors that we talked about in our original video were number one, global climate teleconnections, number two, sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico, our moisture source region, and number three, drought in the elevated mixed layer source region out west. We'll start off with the first one, global climate teleconnections, and we've really focused on one main one called the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO. And just as a refresher, ENSO refers to the sea surface temperature anomalies in the equatorial Pacific. So that region of the Pacific Ocean that lies right along the equator. If those waters are cooler than normal, we're in a La Niña phase of ENSO. If they're warmer than normal, we're in an El Niño phase. And if those waters are about normal as far as temperature goes, we're in a neutral phase of ENSO. And there's been quite a bit of research showing that the El Niño Southern Oscillation phase, and particularly how it progresses throughout the severe weather season, can modulate tornadic activity in the United States during the spring months. And it's also a somewhat reliable tool that we can use when we're making longer term forecasts, such as the one we were making in our original video, because we can somewhat reliably forecast how ENSO is going to progress months ahead of time. We talked about some of the other climate teleconnections in that initial video, and those really can only be forecast maybe a couple to a few weeks in advance, which is not good enough for our purposes of making a longer term, more seasonal forecast of tornadic activity. And quite frankly, those other climate teleconnections are really not my forte, and they can become sort of an alphabet soup. You've got the NAO, the PDO, the MJO, and they all refer to slightly different climate teleconnections, and they can become kind of confusing. But the El Niño Southern Oscillation is one of our most reliable tools in forecasting tornadic activity in the U.S. well out in advance, like the forecast we were making in our initial video. Now, going into this year, we were firmly entrenched in an extended La Niña phase, and in fact, this was our third consecutive year of having La Niña conditions in place, and it's quite unusual to have such an extended period of either ENSO phase, as you can see on the graph here. This is a graph of sea surface temperature anomalies in that equatorial Pacific region on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis, going all the way back to 1982. This basically shows the ebbs and flows of the ENSO cycle, with the reds being the El Niño phase above those warmer than normal sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific, and the blues are your La Niña phase. You can see our most recent extended period of La Niña starting in early 2020 and going all the way through early 2023. So a 3-year La Niña, but we were expected to come out of this La Niña phase during the spring of 2023. I showed this graph in our original video back in March, and this is a bunch of model predictions showing how ENSO phase would progress throughout 2023. And again, this was done back in February of 2023. So this basically showed the model predictions of how ENSO would progress throughout the year. And on the vertical axis, once again, we have that equatorial Pacific sea surface temperature anomaly. And on the bottom, we have our 3-month running average. So basically, essentially time on the horizontal axis. But if you recall from our original video, we talked about the Oceanic Niño Index, that measurement of the sea surface temperature anomalies in the equatorial Pacific. That is done on a 3-month running average. So basically, this initial point here, NDJ, this was our equatorial Pacific sea surface temperature anomalies averaged for the months of November, December, and January, NDJ. And we do that on a 3-month running average to basically get a little bit more refined look, a refined measurement of the sea surface temperature anomalies and how they're progressing in the equatorial Pacific. Because you can have localized events, perhaps, that may overall make the average a little bit, or make a single measurement a little bit weird. So we average them out over a 3-month period, and then we do a running average. So November, December, January, December, January, February, January, February, March, February, March, April, May, and so on and so forth. So you'll notice here back on this graph, we started off the year, November, December, January, in a firmly entrenched in that La Nina phase, with temperatures probably about minus 0.7 to 0.8 there in the equatorial Pacific. Again, this minus 0.5 to 0.5 region is our neutral phase. Warmer temperatures here indicating El Nino, and cooler temperatures indicating La Nina. So we were firmly entrenched in that La Nina phase, and our January observation right here was warming slightly, but still well entrenched in that La Nina phase. And again, you can see a lot of the models were expecting us to pull into that neutral phase by the spring months, March, April, May, June, July. So right in here, lots of those models well within that neutral phase, almost all the models within that neutral phase of ENSO. And we were expected to be into an El Nino phase, at least on the upper end of the neutral scale to a weak to moderate El Nino by summer into fall of 2023. Well, this is our current map. This is from July 2023, and these are our April, May, June observations. We're basically right on the top echelon of the neutral phase, 0.5 there, with our June observation coming in well above that, almost to the 1 degree warm anomaly there in the equatorial Pacific, with quite a bit of warming still expected throughout the year. We were expected to peak now much higher than what we were before into that moderate to even strong El Nino phase. Most of these models are in that moderate to strong El Nino phase come the end of summer into fall. Well, if you notice before our April, May, June observations, we have 0.5 here on the graph. Well, back in our February map, that April, May, June average was expected to be right around that neutral mark, 0 degrees Celsius sea surface temperature anomaly. So what happened during this season was that we actually we had that transition from La Nina to neutral and eventually El Nino, but it happened a little bit quicker than expected. So by May and June, we were well entrenched in the with the warmer than normal sea surface temperature anomalies in the equatorial Pacific, and in turn the El Nino phase of ENSO. Now this map here is going to show how sea surface temperature anomalies have progressed since last year. This starts in August of 2022, and this shows weekly average sea surface temperature anomalies. The blue colors are cooler than normal sea surface temperatures, and the yellows, oranges, and reds are warmer than normal sea surface temperatures. And once again, we're focusing on this equatorial Pacific region right in here, that region of the Pacific right along the equator. So you see, starting back in August of 2022, we were well within that La Nina phase, very much cooler than normal sea surface temperatures in that equatorial Pacific region. And we'll play the map here, play the animation here, and you'll see we continue with that La Nina into the start of 2023, and then very quickly we see that transition here, especially May into June. This is April 2023. We start to see mostly neutral temperatures there in the equatorial Pacific, with some extreme warming happening out here off the coast of South America. But watch what happens as we go into May and June. These temperatures really warm across the equatorial Pacific, and then our current state, we are well entrenched in that El Nino phase with much warmer than normal temperatures across that El Nino, or across the equatorial Pacific region. So that transition happened a little bit more rapidly than what was expected. and the implications that that had on the severe weather season. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. We looked at a number of different research articles showing that ENSO phase was a pretty good modulator of tornado frequency and distribution in the spring in the U.S., and we focused on one in particular, this one by Lee et al. 2016, showing that instead of just the raw ENSO phase that dominated the spring months being the best modulator, it was in fact how ENSO phase progressed throughout the spring season that was a little bit better tool in predicting how tornado frequency and distribution would pan out during the spring months in the U.S. And once again, all the links to these papers are in the description box of the original video, which I've linked in the description box to this video below. So in this paper, they categorized a number of different ENSO phase progressions during the spring months, and the one that fit our situation best was this transitioning La Nina. So our transitioning La Nina phase, meaning that we were coming out of an extended period of La Nina and then going into a more neutral to eventually an El Nino phase by the end of the spring months into the summer and fall of our given year. And the interesting factors that they found were that the tornado frequency and distribution was most modulated by this transitioning La Nina during the March and April months, particularly in April. So these darker squares are going to be where a tornado outbreak is more probable during a transitioning La Nina. So in the month of March, we had a nice stretch from the Midwest down into Missouri, eastern Oklahoma, and then a little bit of a maximum there in the southeast. And then in April, we really had a couple of significant areas. Number one, more of your traditional tornado alley type locations. So Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. And also a little bit of a maximum there in the Midwest states to the Ohio River Valley. So it looked like this transitioning La Nina may provide us a good opportunity to get back to a more traditional tornado season where we had a pretty active early season, but in our more typical tornadic activity locations. So your central to southern plains areas, and then also a separate area in the Midwest. They also found that the linkage between ENSO phase and this ENSO progression and tornado activity in the U.S. was much stronger during the early spring months, so March and April, as opposed to May and June. The linkage between ENSO phase, or in other words, ENSO phase or ENSO progression, was not as good of a modulator of tornado frequency and distribution in the U.S. as you went later on into the spring. So May and June was a little bit up in the air as far as how this linkage would play out. But nonetheless, it looked like a fairly active early spring given this transitioning La Nina phase, and also our highlighted areas in the study here during the early spring months there from the traditional areas of the central to southern plains and then into the Midwest, especially highlighting the month of April. There was some evidence, including this paper from Mays et al. 2008, that showed that we might see a little bit of an uptick in tornadic activity across the central to northern high plains, especially going into the May and June time frame. Even though a lot of our analog years showed a quieter May through June, there was some evidence from especially Mays et al. 2008 that we might see a little bit of an anomalously strong area of low pressure and some anomalously strong moisture making its way into the central to northern high plains. So places like Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska, during the spring months, especially that May through June timeframe in these years that they termed La Nina going out, or weakening La Nina phases. The next factor we talked about was sea surface temperatures and the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, the Gulf of Mexico is our moisture source region for severe weather events in the United States. And very intuitively, if we have a warmer than normal Gulf of Mexico, the air mass above that will be much juicier, much more unstable. So when that gets pulled northward into the U.S., the storms that act upon that air mass will tend to be a little bit more robust because you have a juicier, more unstable air mass in that warm sector, as opposed to a cooler than normal Gulf of Mexico, which provides a lot less juicy, a lot less unstable air mass. And so tornadic activity tends to increase a bit when you have a warmer than normal Gulf of Mexico. So we'll go back to our animation of sea surface temperature anomalies, and we'll start now at the end of February into the start of March, so the start of our March through June time frame. And I'll play the animation here, and again, we're focusing on the Gulf of Mexico. Those yellows, oranges, and reds are warmer than normal. The blues are cooler than normal temperatures, sea surface temperatures. And again, we're focusing on the Gulf of Mexico, and you'll notice that we start out warm, and we pretty much stay warm throughout the entirety of the spring season. We'll play the animation here, and except for a couple of weeks, very brief time spans We stay warm throughout the entirety of the spring months. Of course, we have heard a lot of news coverage about those 100-degree sea surface temperatures off the Florida Keys there. The Gulf is very, very warm, and it has stayed that way since the start of the spring months. So we have had a very juicy reserve, a very large reserve of juicy air mass out across the Gulf of Mexico, and the moisture quality was usually not too much of an issue this season across the U.S. thanks to that very warm Gulf of Mexico. The last factor we talked about was drought in the higher terrain areas out to the west, because that's where our elevated mixed layer comes from. We talk about the elevated mixed layer all the time on this channel. The elevated mixed layer, or EML, is a layer of warm, dry, well-mixed air that originates on the higher terrain out to the west. So West Texas, New Mexico, Southeast Colorado, etc. And that gets transported on the mid-level southwesterly or westerly flow out to the east atop the low-level moist layer in the plains, the southeast, the Midwest, wherever. And that EML acts as a cap on the atmosphere that can, number one, suppress convection for much of the day in a given environment, which allows instability to build and build and build until you have a lifting mechanism to erode the cap fully. Now, when you have very strong drought out here in the elevated mixed layer source region, that can lead to a very, very warm EML. When you have a very, very warm EML, sometimes that can be too strong to break, even with an adequate lifting mechanism. So when you have strong drought out here, your EML can often be a little bit too warm, and that can allow for more elevated convection or suppress convection altogether, which of course negates the tornado threat in given environments. So we want to see a little bit more moderate to low levels of drought in the elevated mixed layer source region. And that can be a big factor, a big modulating factor for tornadic activity out to the east. Now, this was my big question mark going into this severe weather season. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor map from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln from back on February 28th, so right before our March through June time period commenced. The warmer the colors, the more extreme the drought. So the reds and dark reds indicate extreme drought, while the whites and yellows and light oranges indicate low to moderate levels of drought. Now you'll notice in pretty much the entirety of our elevated mixed layer source region out here, West Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, etc., we had low to moderate levels of drought across the entire region. And I wasn't sure how this was going to impact the severe weather season. We've seen plenty of years, especially in recent years, where we've had much more extreme drought than this across this region. That did have some impacts on the severe weather potential and tornado potential out to the east. But we said we'd have to monitor how this progressed throughout the season, and if it would worsen any, that may become an issue. I didn't think it was going to become an issue because we had an active jet stream thanks to that transitioning La Nina phase. We had pretty much an active jet stream that was forecast, and that would provide the consistent mechanisms for lift that could erode the cap completely in these environments across the plains, the Midwest, the Southeast. But again, we'd have to monitor how this drought would progress. If this was to worsen any, then we may start talking about some issues. But if we kept it at this level and perhaps even mitigated the drought somewhat, we shouldn't have too many issues given the strong lifting mechanisms from the active jet stream. Now, we also looked at this map in our original video. This was the seasonal drought outlook going out through the end of May from back on February 28th. And these areas in brown, basically the entirety of our elevated mixed layer source region, that is where drought was expected to persist. Perhaps not worsen, perhaps not get any better, but it was expected to maintain some level of drought in this area, and areas of West Texas even were expected to develop some levels of drought. So again, this outlook for the drought was a little bit up in the air, and we'd have to monitor how it progressed throughout the season. Well, it did not get any worse throughout the season, thankfully. Again, this was on February 28th, and I'll progress through the season. So keep your eyes here on the higher terrain areas out here, West Texas, New Mexico, Colorado. As we go through the season, you'll see that the drought stays pretty consistent going through March and April, but then we start to see a pretty drastic reduction in the drought, especially across eastern Colorado and eastern New Mexico and in the Texas Panhandle as we go into June. We had quite a bit of rainfall out here, and just anecdotally, from chasing out in this region throughout this year, I've really never seen it this green across the Texas Panhandle, the Oklahoma Panhandle, into Colorado, and even New Mexico. Areas were extremely green across these states, these portions of this region, because we had a lot of rainfall, and actually we had quite a bit of drought mitigation as we went later on into the season. So drought did not become a major issue. We didn't really have any elevated mixed layer problems throughout the season, thanks to a drought that stayed pretty consistent, low to moderate drought that stayed pretty consistent early on into the season, and then eventually decreased somewhat going into the end of May, into June, the latter portions of our severe weather season. So using that information, we came up with a general forecast for tornado frequency and distribution throughout the U.S. for that March through June timeframe. We'd said that March would probably continue as a more normal month, with most of the activity confined to the southern portion of the country. So Texas, southeast Oklahoma, into Louisiana, Arkansas, and the rest of the southeast. And then we'd really focus on April for the majority of our tornadic activity this season. We'd have quite an above average April, and we'd have a somewhat of a return to our more typical areas for tornadic activity during the spring. We'd had, in previous years, a little bit more of an eastward bias to things, and that we really return this year, especially during the month of April, to our more normal areas for tornado occurrences. So the central to southern plains, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, with a potential secondary maximum in the Midwest to the Ohio River Valley. Now, going into May and June, it was a little bit less clear, as we talked about the ENSO linkage weakens the further into the season you go. But a lot of our analogs in these years where we had transitioning La Niñas, warm Gulf of Mexico sea surface temperatures, and low to moderate drought in the elevated mixed layer source region out west, they tended to have more quiet May through June periods. And so we thought that perhaps we'd see a little bit more of the same thing this year, perhaps a below average May and June, still with a highlighted area in the central to southern plains, our more normal tornado activity areas, with also a potential area in the central to northern high plains, Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, the Dakotas, but overall a below average second half of the season. So when you add all of that up, that came out to an above average early half of the season, March through April, and then a below average May through June, with still some of those highlighted areas, perhaps coming back to our more normal areas, the central to southern plains, and perhaps even the Midwest as well. That accounted for mostly an average tornado season. Now, what actually happened this season? Well, we started off the season quite a bit above average after a very, very active January and February. Lots of ebbs and flows throughout the season. We did remain above average for the year throughout much of the season. We did dip to about average or just slightly below average during the month of June before finishing out the season slightly above average for the year. So we started a bit above average and ended a bit above average. Overall, that translates to really an average season, at least as far as numbers go. Now, when we're talking about the average tornado count per month in the U.S., it's going to depend on the time frame that is used to create that average. So, for example, this one uses the period from 1999 to 2018. You see from March through June, respectively, we have 80, 189, 272, and 202 for each of those months. And this one takes into account the 1991 to 2020 period, so the numbers are going to be slightly different. 92, 212, 294, and 212 for March, April, May, and June, respectively. But the overall idea is the same. Of course, May is going to be our peak month for tornadic activity in the U.S., right approaching that 300 number, sandwiched in between April and June, right about that 200 number. And then we have March, which is our lowest frequency month in the U.S. for tornadoes, at least as far as the spring season goes, with just below that 100 mark for the month. So as we said, we started off the season quite a bit above average for the year, thanks to a hyperactive January and February, and that continued into March. In fact, the January through March period this year was the most active January through March on record. The month of March closed out with a whopping 253 tornado reports, which is about 3 times greater than average, so a very, very active month, at least from a numbers perspective. We started off the month with a small tornado outbreak from Texas into the Mid-South on March 2nd and 3rd. Of course, we had the Southeast outbreak on March 24th that included the Rolling Fork, Mississippi EF4. But the vast majority, about 2/3 of the total tornado reports for the month of March, came in on just one day, and that day was March 31st. If you recall, we had the dual high-risk areas from the SPC on that day, one centered on southeast Iowa and one to the south in Arkansas. 163 tornado reports in total just on March 31st alone, and it's actually moved into third all-time as far as tornado reports in a 24-hour period goes, behind only the 1974 and 2011 super outbreaks. So a very prolific outbreak indeed, and that, of course, skews the numbers quite a bit for the month of March. About 64% of all the tornado reports in the month of March came from just this one day on March 31st. But if you were to take out those 163 tornado reports from the total for the month of March, that leaves you with about 90 tornado reports. That's right about average for March in general. So March was a decently active month if you were to take out March 31st. But of course, March 31st vaulted the month of March into the extremely active category this year, at least from a numbers perspective. From a spatial perspective, we have two different swaths of tornado reports here, as you see on the map. One down here in the southeast, from Texas into the southeast states, and one sector up here into the Midwest. Of course, skewed greatly by the March 31st outbreak, especially this Midwest sector. We had said originally that tornado activity for the month of March was going to be fairly normal, at least from a numbers perspective, and that most of that activity would stay farther to the south, confined to states like Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, into the southeast, which we definitely had here. But of course, we missed this Midwest sector, which again was skewed quite a bit by the March 31st outbreak. So overall, not a bad forecast for March, but the March 31st outbreak did put a monkey wrench into things and took March into the extremely active category when it was not expected to be at least as active as it was. Now, April was the month we were focusing on to be quite a bit above average as far as tornado activity across the U.S., when in reality, quite the opposite ended up happening. Only 121 tornado reports in total for the entire month of April in the U.S. That's about half of what we usually see, so very much a below average April for tornado activity across the U.S. We'll talk about how the upper air pattern progressed throughout the season in just a bit and how it relates to those factors that we talked about in our original video. But what happened was, as we said, we'd started off the year very active. That's because we had a very active jet stream, basically a wave train, trough after trough after trough, moving into the central U.S. Well, that dried up as we went into April, and we really lost that support from the jet stream aloft, of course with a couple of exceptions. We started off April by continuing that active stretch from March as the jet stream remained active for the first few days of the month. We had a tornado outbreak on April 4th, in which we had a very similar setup to March 31st. We had dual moderate risks this time, one up in the Midwest, one down in the Mid-South, but some limiting factors precluded a much larger outbreak, although we did have a few notable tornadoes, including one EF3 near Lewistown, Illinois. For the rest of the month, pretty sporadic activity with the exception of a couple of days. April 15th, we had a cluster of tornado reports in eastern Missouri and southwest Illinois, as well as on April 19th, we had an outbreak, a localized outbreak near the Oklahoma City metro area, in which one cyclic supercell produced 18 different tornadoes, including an EF3 that did some damage in the town of Cole, Oklahoma, and as well as other notable ones near Etowah and Shawnee. But other than that, a pretty sporadic month for tornadic activity. Not much to speak of, and definitely a miss as far as numbers go. Definitely a below average month, a well below average month, in a month we were forecasting well above average activity. From a spatial perspective, not really a ton you can pick out as far as localized maxima of tornado activity. Perhaps one cluster here in the Midwest, which does go along with our hypothesis that we would see a maximum, at least through the early part of the season, in the Midwest. Not a ton of activity, though, in our normal, traditional Tornado Alley locations, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, that we were forecasting that would be a perhaps heightened area for tornadic activity this year, with the exception of the April 19th event, of course. But overall, a pretty quiet April for the Central and Southern Plains, which goes against what we were talking about in our original video. May was another month that saw a below-average tornado count across the United States. Just 199 total tornado reports for the month of May, a pretty significant departure from normal, but it was not quite as quiet as April was, and that was thanks in large part to a notable tornado outbreak sequence that occurred between May 10th and May 13th, really peaking between May 11th and the 13th. It started off in Colorado and northwest Kansas on May 10th, a few tornadoes up there before shifting into more of a bifurcated setup. More of a cold core-esque environment up in northwest Kansas produced several tornadoes on the 11th, as well as another localized tornado outbreak near the Oklahoma City metro area that did some damage to the town of Cole and surrounding areas. It then shifted for the peak of the outbreak on May 12th up in mostly Nebraska, where there were 50 tornado reports on May 12th in total, mostly across Nebraska, with the most notable being the photogenic wedge near the town of Spalding, as well as a few tornadoes in eastern Nebraska, and there were also some up in northeast Kansas. And for the final day of the outbreak, a couple separate supercells in Iowa each produced multiple tornadoes on the 13th. So that 4-day stretch produced over 100 tornado reports, accounting for more than half of the total tornado reports in the U.S. for the month of May. Other than that, it was a pretty quiet month, fairly modest tornado activity. There was perhaps a slight hotspot down in the southern high plains, particularly eastern New Mexico. The running joke this year amongst chasers was the almost daily chasing near the town of Clovis in eastern New Mexico, and there were certainly some tornado days down there and bleeding into the Texas Panhandle. But definitely a below average month for tornado frequency across the U.S. in May, and that definitely does support our forecast in the original video, which stated that we might see a below average May and a quiet overall second half of the season based on some of the analogs that shared some of the conditions that we were seeing for this spring. As far as distribution goes, there's a clear hotspot spanning the Central Plains from Colorado and Wyoming into Kansas and Nebraska, even into Iowa. And that does support some of the research showing that we could see a highlighted area in the Central High Plains and areas to the east, Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, as well as a return to our southern plains, central to southern plains targets, Kansas, Oklahoma into West Texas, somewhat of a clustering there as well. We then finished off the season with June, which ended up being quite an active month for all types of severe weather across the U.S., including tornadoes. If you are a storm chaser, you know that there were pretty much daily opportunities for quality storm chasing across the U.S. in June, and those opportunities produced no shortage of tornadoes. 226 tornado reports in total for the month of June, which is just at or right above average for the month of June in the U.S. That was highlighted by days like June 2nd across southwest Texas, June 15th, which featured the destructive Perryton, Texas tornado in the northeast Texas Panhandle, June 21st, which featured a tornado outbreak in northeast Colorado from where one single cyclic supercell produced over 30 tornadoes by itself, as well as down in Texas, a significant tornado struck the town of Matador. And then on June 23rd, where we had a localized outbreak across southeast Wyoming into far western Nebraska. Over a third of the days in June, 11 out of 30, yielded double-digit tornado reports, and there was almost daily tornadic activity across the U.S. throughout the month. There really weren't any lulls in tornado frequency throughout the month of June in the U.S. That all adds up to a very active month and a slightly above average tornado count for the month of June. This is in contrast to our original forecast, which stated that, like May, June might tend to be a little bit below average as far as tornado frequency in the U.S., given some of the analogs and some of the features of the background pattern we were seeing. But that was not the case. June ended up being fairly active and made up for somewhat of a lackluster May. Now, as for distribution, a clear signal in the central high plains, northeast Colorado into southeast Wyoming. It seemed like Chugwater, Wyoming was the place to be for much of June, and there were multiple days, multiple tornado events that occurred in that general vicinity. So a clear signal in the central high plains, which supports some of the work in articles such as Mays et al. 2008, which highlighted the central plains in these transitioning La Nina type setups. Now, one of the most surprising features of the entire tornado season, let alone June, was this cluster of reports in the southeast, cluster of tornadic activity across the southeast states. Of course, the southeast severe weather season is usually early on in the spring, February, March, April. By June, it's usually time for those summertime pop-up thunderstorms that go up and die off pretty quickly. They produce some wet microbursts, but that's about it. That was not the case. We had several days here toward the middle of June where we had severe weather across the southeast, including some tornadic activity. For example, June 18th, this cluster of reports in south central Mississippi was from June 18th, in which we had a nocturnal localized tornado outbreak across that area that produced over 20 tornado reports there. So very surprising to see that. We'll talk about why that likely happened in just a bit. But overall, a couple clear areas of tornadic occurrence here in June, the Central High Plains, and surprisingly, the Southeast. All right, let's dive in quickly to the background pattern and how it progressed throughout the season and relate it to some of those factors we talked about in the original video and reviewed in the earlier part of this video. We'll start out at the surface. The black contours here are the pressure contours, and the shading is dew point temperature. And your greens are going to be anything above 60 degrees Fahrenheit dew point. Your yellows are going to be your 70s dew points plus. So stay focused on the moisture more so here. I just wanted to show how that reservoir of significant surface dew points stayed well situated over the Gulf for much of the season. That's because, in part, we had that very warm Gulf of Mexico water. So that air mass above the Gulf was energized, and it was very easy to get that northward into the places like the plains and the Midwest. We go toward the end of March there, now toward April, and you see those 60s and 70s dew points situated right offshore, easily moving inland here. This is that April 4th, the morning after the April 4th event, easily pulled northward by that surface flow there up in the northern plains. But we also never really swept out the Gulf with any significant frontal intrusion. You'll see every once in a while those 60s dew points disappear here from the Gulf, but it was very easy to get those back as that Gulf air mass was very energized and easy to pull northward. We didn't really have any frontal intrusions to really cool the Gulf for a prolonged period of time and sort of de-energize the air mass, if you will. Here it is in May. Pretty consistent reservoir of moisture in the plains and up into the Midwest. And into June, moisture was a big factor in some of the severe weather events in the central high plains, Colorado into New Mexico, and even Wyoming up there. On multiple occasions, we were able to get upper 60s to even 70s dew points into places like eastern Colorado, southeast Wyoming, eastern New Mexico. And when you have 60s and 70s dew points in those regions, which is very rare in the first place, when you get that in those regions, for example, here, upper 60 dew points into eastern Colorado, that is a very strong indicator of tornadic activity in most cases in those regions, because as we've talked about before, the air doesn't hold as much moisture in those higher elevations. So when you have strong moisture like that, you have a very energized atmosphere, and oftentimes when you're chasing in those higher terrain areas like northeast Colorado, you want to just basically find the best dew points. And in northeast Colorado on June 21st, when we had that cyclic supercell in northeast Colorado produced over 30 tornadoes, we had 70s dew points up there in that vicinity, which is very rare for Colorado and helped out in that case. So moisture, not an issue at all this season. And we had a very nice reservoir of moisture situated across the Gulf and easily pulled northward into our tornadic activity regions throughout the season. Now, as we take a look at the upper air pattern, we'll use the 500 millibar map from March through June. As we talked about, March was quite active, and that was thanks to a very active jet stream. You can see the wave train here bringing in trough after trough after trough to the central U.S., culminating with that big old trough, as you see here, that was the impetus for the March 31st tornado outbreak across the Midwest into the Mid-South. This is a very La Nina-esque pattern. La Ninas tend to favor a very active early portion of the season because of a more energized jet stream, especially in the southern half of the United States, but it can extend farther north into the Midwest like it did this year. So a very La Nina-esque pattern that we saw through March that tried to continue into early April, but we eventually lost that support from the jet stream. We were undergoing the transition at this time from the weakening La Nina into neutral and eventually El Nino phase of ENSO. We started to develop a little bit of ridging here in the west, trough out east, an unfavorable setup for significant severe weather across the central U.S. But we would eventually return to a pattern favorable for at least some troughing, although, as we talked about, April was a little bit on the slow side as far as tornadic activity goes. Not quite super favorable looking troughs on a regular basis in April, and that would continue into May. And by this point, we were well on our way into the upper end of the neutral phase, into the El Nino phase, and really May struggled, at least to start, with this feature called an omega block, where you have a trough out to the west, a trough out to the east, and you have a big ridge in between the two. It looks like the Greek letter omega, hence the name omega block. And we struggled with that to start off May, and at a few points during the month of May, we struggled with this omega block, and these omega blocks can be very difficult to dissolve. Now, we would, as we said, become entrenched in the El Nino phase of ENSO by late May into June. And in May, we had a couple of trough intrusions in here, but mostly a somewhat dead-looking upper air pattern here, at least for significant severe weather across the central to southern plains. But we would see at least a return of the subtropical jet. A little bit of enhanced flow down here across the southern portion of the country. And that was the impetus for all this severe weather across West Texas, eastern New Mexico, toward the end of May into early June. We had what's called the subtropical jet start to take over. Even though it wasn't very energized, not really strong flow associated with the subtropical jet, it was the main impetus for the severe weather, at least in the southern portion of the U.S. during this time. This is a very El Nino-like pattern when you have the subtropical jet that is the main player. If you haven't heard of the subtropical jet before, the jet stream is split into two different jets. You have the polar jet stream, which is up farther to the north. You see these troughs up here in the northern portion of the U.S. into Canada. That is the polar jet stream. We have a separate stream down to the south called the subtropical jet stream. In El Nino phases of ENSO, the subtropical jet stream tends to dominate, and we tend to see a little bit more activity down here to the south. As the jet stream is displaced a little bit farther south, that subtropical jet stream is more active. And that's exactly what we saw in the latter stages of May going into June, before at least some return to troughiness throughout the month of June. There's a little bit of that omega block in play to start June as well. Trough in the west, trough in the east, a little bit of ridging there in the middle. Still some strong flow, helping to enhance the severe weather potential down to the south in June. But we would see a return, and that subtropical jet really shines here as we won't go into the middle part of June. This enhanced flow here, part of the subtropical jet, making its way into the southern portions of the country and helping to provide the impetus for that significant severe weather in the southeastern U.S., which is, again, a rarity this time of year. Even in El Nino patterns, it is extremely rare to get significant tornadic activity in the southeast in June. Usually that subtropical jet will still start to migrate a little bit farther to the north, and you'll see that Central Plains area start to light up come June. But we did see that subtropical jet take shape across the southeast toward the middle of June, and we also saw a little bit of a return to some more robust troughiness here in the Central Plains come the last couple of weeks of June. Big old trough here in the northwest here on June 20th, and we continue that way through the end of June with multiple severe weather events up here in the Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska area to close out the season. Now, as we talked about before, the jet stream is modulated often more by those other global climate teleconnections that occur on timescales much shorter than the El Nino Southern Oscillation. But in my opinion, it was pretty clear the influence of the El Nino Southern Oscillation on the jet stream this year, and in turn the tornadic activity in the U.S. this spring. We started off, as we talked about, very active throughout March, lots of troughing here across the country, very La Nina-esque period. And then we shifted into more of a neutral to El Nino type setup where the subtropical jet stream won out, and we had a lot of activity remain here in the south across as we went into the latter portion of the season. Very El Nino-like setup there. So the ENSO was I think a pretty strong indicator of how this season played out, a pretty strong modulator of how this season played out, along with the other factors that we discussed earlier on in the video. So as far as our original forecast goes, I think it fared okay. It didn't fare great. It didn't fare poorly. There were parts that went well, and there were parts that did not do so hot. I think frequency is where we fell short the most. We had expected after a fairly normal March to really focus on April as the month with the most activity, given the transitioning La Nina period, some of the work from Lee et al. 2016, the warm Gulf, etc. Looked like April was going to be the highlight of the severe weather season. And the opposite of that ended up happening. March was extremely active, and then we went into April, which was the quietest of the 4 months in our spring severe weather period, followed by a very quiet May. We did say that May and June would probably be on the quieter side based on some analogs and some of the background pattern characteristics. While May was quiet, and we did do well in that part of the forecast, June was not. June was actually fairly active, and that was thanks to more of a flip toward the El Nino phase and that subtropical jet staying pretty solid throughout the month of June. So frequency did not do too hot. We expected an active early half of the season with a very below average second half of the season to all in all come toward a fairly average season. And that overall was a fairly good forecast. We started off just above average in the beginning of March, and we ended just above average at the end of June. So all in all, that accounts for an average season. We had forecast an average season. It didn't quite play out as expected from a month-to-month basis, but overall it was a fairly average season, and that did okay. Distribution, on the other hand, I think we did okay on as well. We had highlighted some areas of perhaps enhanced severe weather potential. We had said that we might see a return to a more traditional tornado alley, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, in this severe weather season, as well as a maximum in the Midwest to Ohio River Valley. Definitely did well on the Ohio River Valley Midwest target. There were several big events up there this year. You can see a very nice cluster of tornado reports up there in those Midwest states. As far as the central to southern plains sector goes, not too well. There was not a whole bunch of activity in these areas there, except for a couple of events, as we talked about, in April and May there in Oklahoma, and a couple of other sporadic events here in Texas into Kansas. But overall, that Southern Plains target didn't really verify as expected. There was not so much of an eastward bias as maybe the last couple of years. We did have a decent amount of southeast activity, and especially later on in the season, which was a very big surprise, I think, for a lot of forecasters. You don't expect to see all that tornadic activity in the southeast states in June. You expect to see that maybe in March and April. We had a fairly quiet early season, at least a fairly average early season in March in the southeast. April, very quiet in the southeast. But in June, we made up for that big time, and that was a big surprise there. The Central Plains also lit up, especially later on in the season. Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska was a big player in this severe weather season as well. We had looked at papers from Mays et al. 2008 and some others showing that that could be the case, so we did well in that regard. So that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully that was a nice little recap of the tornadic activity across the U.S. this spring. And it just goes to show you that it is extremely, extremely difficult to forecast tornadic activity months in advance accurately. We can do a decent job by looking at things like global climate teleconnections, drought in the EML source region, Gulf of Mexico sea surface temperatures, etc. But tornado activity is just so predicated on smaller scale features and other things that we just can't see that far ahead of time. But overall, I think we did an okay job of forecasting an overall average season as far as distribution goes, even though we may not have nailed the progression of the season that well. And we also did okay in looking at some possible localized maxima for tornado occurrence, such as the Midwest and the Central Plains. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.